Nicolás Maduro stood before a cheering crowd, his hand raised in victory. He had just been sworn in for a third term as president of Venezuela, but the air was thick with tension. The date was January 10, 2025, and the world watched with a mixture of apprehension and anger. The preceding election, held in July 2024, had been mired in controversy. Allegations of fraud and voter suppression ran rampant. International observers, including organizations like the Organization of American States, had condemned the process as deeply flawed. Maduro's main challengers, figures like Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado, refused to recognize the results. They called for fresh elections, their voices echoing the frustrations of many Venezuelans. The economy was in shambles, hyperinflation had crippled daily life, and basic necessities were scarce. Yet, Maduro remained defiant. He dismissed the criticism as foreign interference, a narrative he often employed to consolidate his power. With the military still largely behind him, he seemed determined to cling to power regardless of the cost. The international community responded swiftly and decisively. The United States, along with many European and Latin American nations, refused to recognize Maduro's new term. They denounced the election as illegitimate, a blow to Venezuela's already tarnished democratic credentials. Sanctions, already in place against Venezuela, were tightened. The US in particular targeted the country's oil industry, its economic lifeline. These measures, while intended to cripple the Maduro regime, also exacerbated the suffering of ordinary Venezuelans. The European Union followed suit, imposing travel bans and asset freezes on high-ranking Venezuelan officials. They called for a return to dialogue and the restoration of democratic order. Yet, with Maduro showing little interest in compromise, the situation seemed destined to deteriorate further. Despite the risks, opposition figures within Venezuela continued to raise their voices. Edmundo Gonzalez, a charismatic leader who had gained a considerable following, called for peaceful protests. He urged his supporters to remain steadfast in their demands for free and fair elections. Maria Corina Machado, a fierce critic of Maduro's socialist policies, echoed these sentiments. She denounced the government's crackdown on dissent and human rights abuses. Her bravery, in the face of threats and intimidation, galvanized many Venezuelans. But the opposition faced an uphill battle. The government, through its control of the media and security forces, effectively silenced dissent. Protests were met with brutal force, and many opposition leaders found themselves behind bars, charged with treason or inciting violence. Section 4. A nation divided. The political crisis cut deep into Venezuelan society, creating a chasm between those who supported Maduro and those who opposed him. The country, once one of the wealthiest in Latin America, was now deeply divided. Maduro's supporters, many from the working class who had benefited from social programs, saw him as a champion of the poor. They believed the opposition, with its ties to the wealthy elite, would dismantle these programs and worsen their plight. On the other side, a growing number of Venezuelans blamed Maduro's policies for the economic ruin. They yearned for a return to prosperity and democratic norms. Families were torn apart, friendships strained, as political differences became insurmountable barriers. Section 5. An uncertain path ahead. As 2025 unfolded, the path ahead for Venezuela remained treacherous and uncertain. Maduro, despite international pressure and domestic unrest, appeared determined to consolidate his grip on power. The opposition, though fragmented and facing relentless pressure, continued to fight for democracy. The economy, crippled by mismanagement and sanctions, showed little sign of recovery. Millions of Venezuelans had fled their homeland, seeking refuge in neighboring countries. The humanitarian crisis deepened, with shortages of food, medicine, and basic necessities becoming increasingly dire. The international community, divided on how best to address the crisis, struggled to find common ground. Some advocated for dialogue and diplomacy, while others called for stronger measures, including the possibility of military intervention. The fate of Venezuela hung in the balance, its future uncertain, its people caught in the throes of a deepening political and humanitarian catastrophe.